Have you ever had to walk away from a toxic family member? No names, just yes or no.
At Easter dinner, my brother smirked and said, "A real tech career isn't for everyone." The words landed with the same sting they always had, that sly tone of superiority that he had mastered since childhood. But before I could even respond, my grandmother leaned forward, eyes sharp as a blade, and said, "Funny, didn't your company just buy his?" In that instant, the entire table went silent, forks hovering in midair, wine glasses paused halfway to lips, every relative suddenly frozen as though the air itself had shifted. But before we get to that moment, before the silence that left Ethan's smirk sliding off his face, you need to know how we got there. Because this wasn't just one holiday dinner gone wrong. This was years in the making, years of swallowing my words, letting him have the spotlight, pretending not to care when my own family chose to see me as the side act to his big performance. Growing up, Ethan was the golden boy, the one who got the applause at school plays even when he forgot his lines, the one who got a brand new car when he turned 16 while I inherited the dented Toyota Corolla that had already passed through 3 cousins, the one who had his report cards displayed on the fridge while mine quietly disappeared into a drawer. He was loud, charming in the way people who know they are favored can be charming, always quick with a joke that made the room laugh, even when it was at my expense. I learned early that silence was safer than confrontation, that rolling my eyes or walking away was easier than starting a fight I would never win, because my parents' loyalty to him wasn't subtle, it was baked into the air we breathed at that house. As adults, nothing really changed, except now the battlefield wasn't teenage trophies or who got the biggest slice of cake, it was careers. Ethan went into tech sales, loud and flashy, full of buzzwords he didn't always understand, but delivered with confidence that impressed people who didn't know better. He wore expensive suits, posted pictures of his vacations to Aruba, boasted at family gatherings about his company's explosive growth, and how he was being eyed for a senior role that never quite materialized. Meanwhile, I had taken a quieter path, working behind the scenes at a software company that built infrastructure nobody ever saw, but everybody needed. It wasn't glamorous, there were no glossy vacation photos to post about it, but I liked the work, and slowly I climbed, not with a bang but with persistence, the kind of persistence Ethan had never had to learn. Still, at family gatherings, his voice drowned mine out. When I tried to explain what I did, eyes glazed over. Someone changed the subject, or worse, they nodded politely before asking Ethan about his latest deal. My parents liked to say I was doing fine, which was their polite way of dismissing me, but when Ethan walked in, it was all here comes the future of the family. By the time Easter rolled around this year, I was already bracing myself for more of the same, because holidays were never just holidays in our house, they were a stage for Ethan to perform and for me to sit in the audience, smiling politely as though I was proud of his act. This Easter was different though, even before Grandma's line changed the air in the room. For one thing, I wasn't the same woman I had been at last year's Christmas dinner, when Ethan had mocked me for playing with code like it's a hobby, and the table had erupted in laughter. My company had changed dramatically in the last few months. A merger, whispers of expansion, meetings behind closed doors that even I didn't fully understand at first. By spring, I was carrying knowledge no one at that table had, least of all Ethan, who had no idea that his company's swaggering posture was about to collapse into mine like a house of cards. The week leading up to Easter, I debated whether to even show up. There was something tempting about staying away, letting them have their ham and their smug little conversations without me. But some stubborn part of me wanted to be there, not to gloat exactly, but to see their faces when the truth slipped into the open. I didn't plan to announce it, I didn't want to be that person, but I also wasn't going to hide anymore. I packed my suitcase with that strange mix of dread and anticipation, knowing this Easter was going to be a turning point, even if no one else could see it coming. Driving up to my parents' house that Sunday, I rehearsed how I would handle the inevitable digs. Keep calm, smile, deflect, don't give him the satisfaction of seeing me ruffled. I walked in with a bottle of wine, greeted by the smell of glazed ham and deviled eggs, the table already set with the same floral china we'd used for decades, the same centerpiece of pastel lilies. Cousins clustered in corners, kids darted through the kitchen. My parents beamed as though nothing in the world had changed. And then Ethan appeared, perfect timing as always, wearing a tailored jacket and that smug grin, carrying a bottle of champagne he no doubt expected everyone to thank him for. He hugged Mom, shook Dad's hand, and when he turned to me his smirk widened just enough to say without words, "Ready to lose again?" I could have said something sharp right then. I could have rolled my eyes, or ignored him, or taken the bait. Instead, I smiled, because the real show hadn't even begun, and for once, I wasn't the one about to sit quietly in the shadows. And that is how we all ended up at that table, forks raised, glasses clinking, laughter rolling through the room, until Ethan decided once again to make me his target, never realizing that this time the punchline wasn't his to deliver. By the time the front door had swung open 3 more times and the hallway was filled with coats that still smelled like early spring rain, I could already map the familiar currents of the room. Because every holiday in our family ran like a river with predictable eddies and whirlpools, and if you paid attention you could see how people positioned themselves to be seen, to be praised, to be safe. Dad held court near the stereo where some old crooner played. Mom floated between the kitchen and the dining room, issuing gentle commands and complimenting every casserole as though it had been flown in from Paris. The cousins formed a loose ring around the coffee table like a small jury, and Ethan, of course, took the sunniest spot by the window where the afternoon light made his watch face flash at eye level whenever he gestured, which he did often, as if he were conducting an orchestra that only he could hear. Grandma arrived late, as if on purpose, her small frame wrapped in that pale blue coat she had owned since I was in high school, a coat she refused to replace because she said it had good bones, which is how she talked about everything that mattered. She kissed my cheek and held my gaze for a beat longer than necessary, the way she does when she wants to ask a question without using words, and then she let herself be led to the best chair while Ethan launched into a fast, confident monologue about pipeline velocity and top-of-funnel strategy, phrases that sounded important if you were trying to impress people who couldn't be bothered to ask follow-up questions. I watched my aunt nod like a metronome, watched my dad smile as though the sun had just agreed to keep shining exclusively on his lawn, watched my mother bring out deviled eggs and set them down in front of Ethan first, a small gesture that said more than any toast could have. I took my place in the kitchen, partly because it is easier to breathe there and partly because Mom always trusts me with the practical tasks, slicing lemons, warming rolls, steadying the gravy boat as if it were a newborn, while Ethan is trusted with stories, which is a kind way of saying he gets to brag without lifting a finger. From the doorway, I listened to him tell a cousin how he owned a tier of accounts most reps never touch, a sentence so empty of detail it squeaked, and I toyed with the thought of slipping in a gentle correction about what owning really means when you do not control product, price, or roadmap. But I swallowed it because there is a difference between setting the record straight and letting a man finish building his own stage trapdoor. The appetizers made their rounds, and with them came the teasing, those lazy little darts that families throw because they have years of practice and no fear of consequences. Mom said my job must be very flexible since I work on computers, which apparently means I can just shift the laws of physics around my calendar. Dad asked if my company had figured out how to charge customers yet, the kind of jab that pretends to be a joke while checking for bruises, and Ethan, never one to leave a bruise unprodded, leaned back with the smug comfort of a man sinking into a couch he did not pay for and said, in a tone meant to sound friendly but engineered to wound, that real tech is when you sell something people actually understand, not when you babysit shy coders and call it leadership. I felt the old reflex to laugh it off, to let the comment wash over me and apologize to the room for having the audacity to be there. But I have decided that I will not apologize for existing at my own family table, and besides, I had no interest in giving Ethan the old show where I backed down so he can take a bow. Instead, I smiled as if he had just helped me prove a point I had been trying to make quietly for years, and I asked my cousin Molly, who had been scrolling on her phone with that particular frustration that only bad software can summon, what was wrong, because I could tell from her heavy sighs that she was stuck inside an app whose designers had chosen style over mercy. She turned the screen toward me and said she needed to upload tax forms for a freelance contract, and the upload kept failing with a meaningless error, and before Ethan could perform a diagnosis he was not qualified to give, I took the phone and, without fuss or a speech, I opened the hidden settings menu, flipped off a lazy client-side validation that was choking on file names with hyphens, cleared a cache that the app never bothered to refresh on its own, and retried. The document slid through like a key in a well-oiled lock, the confirmation page rendering with the kind of delicate relief you feel when a stubborn door finally opens, and Molly let out a laugh that sounded like gratitude and mild disbelief, which earned me a quick hug and a, "You just saved me a penalty fee." It was a small thing, not the kind of victory you put on a plaque, but in that room it was a spark you could see from the driveway, because a few heads turned and someone said, "Ask Rachel, she'll know." Which is a sentence I have wanted to hear in that house since I was old enough to hold a screwdriver, and for the first time I did not rush to hand the credit away. Ethan tried to claim the moment by explaining that those forms can be tricky and that compliance tech is its own beast, but the words hung there like plastic fruit, shiny and useless, and Grandma, who had been watching with those needle-bright eyes of hers, reached out, patted my wrist, and said she was glad at least one person at the table knew how the engine worked instead of just admiring the hood. I let that sit, because sometimes revenge isn't a grand speech or a public execution. Sometimes it is a clean fix delivered in front of an audience that assumed you were decoration. And while Ethan shifted in his chair, I multiplied the effect with one more quiet cut, telling Molly that if she wanted to avoid the same error next quarter, she should use a direct upload endpoint and not the third-party wrapper. Then, as if it were an afterthought, I mentioned that our team had open roles for people who actually read documentation and cared about edge cases, a line that made two cousins perk up and ask to talk after dinner, which meant that I had just rerouted the only currency Ethan truly respects, attention and potential favors, without raising my voice or breaking a single rule. Plates clinked, the ham came out glossy and monumental, the room reassembled itself around the dining table, and just when I thought we might float through the meal on that soft current of polite avoidance, Ethan tapped his glass with a fork and announced that we should go around and say what we were grateful for this year, an old tradition he had never once cared about until it gave him a microphone. He saved me for last, like a magician lining up a final reveal. And when the circle came to me, he smiled with all his teeth and said, "Why don't you tell Grandma what you actually do, Rachel, since we keep hearing it matters so much," which landed with the weight of a dare, and that is where I looked at him, felt the room's eyes slide toward me like beads on a string, and decided that if he wanted a stage I would hand him one, only the trapdoor would be under his feet, not mine. The circle of gratitude had always been a performance disguised as sincerity in our family, a polite carousel where people picked safe answers like health and new curtains and the weather finally warming up. So when Ethan saved me for last with that handsome game show smile and the velvet barb of "tell us what you actually do," I recognized the setup for humiliation, but also the opportunity nested inside it. Because sometimes the most dignified revenge is a calm explanation that refuses to play dumb just because the room expects it. I took a breath long enough to register the cinnamon in the baked apples and the faint whiff of hot wiring from the old chandelier. Then I said that my day-to-day was not glamorous, that it looked like long meetings about ugly problems and diagrams that would bore most of the table to tears, that I managed the connective tissue between 100 small services that either speak clearly or drag each other into the mud, and that my job, stripped of all jargon, was to make sure things people never think about keep working while the visible parts get all the applause. I added that this also meant negotiating with outside vendors when we outgrew them or when their failures became our emergencies, which happens more often than anyone likes to admit. Ethan lifted his glass the way a man does when he is about to interrupt a woman and call it banter, and he said with a chuckle that plumbing is cute, sis, but selling the house is how you make real money, which got a few obedient laughs. The kind that seek permission to exist, and I smiled as though he had gifted me a segue instead of a slight, then asked if he remembered the Friday 2 weeks before Christmas when his customers could not log in for 3 hours right around the time payroll was due for a handful of mid-sized clients because my team had worked late that night shepherding a failing token service that sat exactly between his login screen and every dollar his customers wanted to move. And the only reason his support ticket stopped catching fire was because our on-call found a memory leak in a third-party library and shipped a hotfix before his executive channel had even agreed on a statement. The room did not fully understand the words, but it understood the architecture of the moment, which is sometimes enough. Ethan tried to laugh, then said outages happen and that it is part of the game, then tried to pivot to sales quotas and market share. And I let him pivot because it is always better to let a man run in the direction he thinks is safe before you point out the cliff he forgot to notice. So I asked a simple question that even Grandma could weigh, which was whether he felt comfortable promising next day onboarding to new clients when his company had been publicly rate limited by a provider 3 times in 1 quarter. A detail I plucked not from any confidential dashboard, but from their own status page and customer forum, where angry accountants had posted screenshots like wounded hikers waving flares. He blinked in that way he does when he is choosing between bluff and bluster, then went with the latter, claiming that rate limits were marketing noise and that their partners were aligning on a new throughput narrative, a sentence so puffy it floated. And I simply looked at Grandma and asked if she would feel safer with a bank that calls a broken lock a narrative or with one that fixes the lock before anyone notices the draft, at which point she gave the smallest nod, the kind that says, "A verdict has been quietly filed." I could have stopped there and let the victory be invisible, but I have learned that small mercies rarely change a map, so I turned to my cousin Peter, who runs a tiny landscaping business and had been muttering about an invoicing delay that put him close to a late fee. And I asked him which system he used, then pulled up the public help center on my phone because if a truth cannot survive a daylight search, it has no business at my family table. There, under a cheerful banner and a cartoon of grinning office workers, sat an article dated last month acknowledging intermittent delays in payment clearing due to upstream throttling, and the phrase upstream throttling might as well have been an arrow pointing to Ethan's carefully ironed shirt. Because every person at that table could understand the translation, promises were made that someone else's pipeline could not keep. Ethan said the article was outdated, a classic move that hopes the calendar itself can be cowed into submission, and I said we could check together, then quietly scrolled to the footer where the page showed last updated on Wednesday, which was 2 days ago. And my mother, who loves calendared facts more than she loves nuance, read the date out loud with the same tone she uses to remind people of dental appointments. I did not gloat. I did not raise my voice. I only said that I was grateful this year to work with people who fix things when they break and who do not punish truth for being inconvenient, and I set the phone face down as if laying a card I did not need to look at twice. My revenge, if you could call it that without sounding like a villain in a soap opera, was to redirect the gravitational center of the table by giving usefulness more oxygen than swagger. So when my aunt asked how she could stop her phone from screaming every time the neighborhood group chat explodes, I quietly showed her focus settings and message summaries. When Dad grumbled about his printer, I gave him a 2-step rule that would save him an hour every month. When the kids begged for the Wi-Fi, I made them read the password off the fridge like a spell and taught them where the router lived so they could reboot it without starting a family manhunt. Every fix landed like a small bell, and each bell moved attention 1 chair further from Ethan, who kept tapping his fork against his glass as though applause could be summoned by percussion alone. By the time the platter made a final lap and the gravy boat had left its inevitable brown comet trail across the tablecloth, Ethan had begun to overcompensate, the way a man does when he senses the heat shifting away from his spotlight. He leaned into the cousins with a story about enterprise pilots and a likely Series C valuation, and I, gentle as a breeze that closes a window no one remembers opening, asked whether that valuation had factored in the strategic review his firm had announced on their own investor blog last quarter, a review that often preludes a sale when cash is tight and runway is not a runway but a cul-de-sac, and he snapped that I had no idea what I was talking about, that the review was a sign of strength, that the right buyers would be lucky to align with their vision, and I nodded in a way that let the statement stand precisely because it would not stand for long. Then, with the kind of patience that only gets built one humiliation at a time, I offered my toast. A single ribbon of words meant to sound modest and came out sharper than I planned. I said I was grateful for resilience and for boring plumbing and for the quiet satisfaction of fixing locks before strangers jiggle the handle, and I set my glass down so softly the rim barely kissed the table, which made the silence that followed as loud as a dropped pan, and in that silence Ethan reached for another joke that did not arrive, opened his mouth to reclaim the room, and met Grandma's gaze, which had the weight of a gavel about to fall. Ethan held the room the way a man clings to a life raft he believes is a yacht, and when he said with that lazy grin that I should explain what I actually do so Grandma could finally understand why I am always busy with my little projects, I let the laughter burn itself out and then, in a voice I reserve for fire drills and budget reviews, I said that my work is mostly saying no to cute features that break under pressure, translating customer pain into engineering priority without bruising either side too badly, and preventing heroic fixes by making sure disasters never leave the runway, which means I spend a lot of time inside contracts and failure reports and boring spreadsheets that quietly decide who survives the quarter, I added. Because Grandma appreciates a plain image, that I am the person who checks the bolts on the bridge while the ribbon-cutting crowd cheers at the other end, and that if the bolts are wrong it does not matter how beautiful the ribbon looks when the traffic starts. He smirked in that theatrical way that begs for witnesses and said bridges were fine but real money was made on the toll, which was his not-so-subtle reminder that he works in sales and that sales, to hear him tell it, is the drumbeat that keeps the rest of us from wandering off into the woods, and I nodded as if he had delivered a truth instead of a bumper sticker, then told a little story without names, about a vendor that promised next day onboarding to win a flashy account while quietly borrowing capacity from a partner who had already warned them about limits, and how the promises piled up like chairs on a balcony until the balcony groaned, and how the only reason the building did not make the evening news was because a dull little team with no press kit rerouted the staircase in the night and wrote apology emails the vendor later quoted as proof of their customer obsession. I said it softly, the way you tell a bedtime story that is not really for children, and when he started to interrupt I let him, because men like Ethan prefer to run headfirst into a prop wall than walk around it with a map. He announced that their capacity planning was pristine and that partnerships were stronger than ever, and he tossed in a line about a referral bonus that would put a nice dent in his honeymoon if certain small businesses signed this spring, which was not only crass but clumsy, because Peter, who had been nursing his drink and his irritation at a recurring payout delay, looked up with the expression of a man who has just realized the toll collector is also the one pulling the brake, and I, with a gentleness that felt almost like kindness, asked Peter if he wanted to fix his problem now or keep paying late fees until July, since either path was valid, but only one would let him sleep tonight. We moved our plates just enough to make room for a phone and a napkin, and I had him open his dashboard, export the invoices that were stuck in limbo, and walk through a migration wizard so unassuming it might as well have been a closet door. And while Ethan sputtered about context and slippage and quarterly targets, Peter watched a progress bar that did not lie, then tested a payment that cleared before the toast cooled, and the look he gave me was not the breathless worship Ethan likes to collect, but something more dangerous to him, a quiet decision to stop taking glib answers from men who speak in fog. Peter canceled the trial that had been parked under Ethan's referral link, thanked me with a handshake that lasted a beat too long for the comfort of a man who values his pipeline more than he values his sister, and then, because the universe loves tidy symmetry, my cousin Molly asked if I could send her the same step-by-step after dinner so she could switch before the late fee hits on Tuesday. Mom tried to save the mood with a compliment about the glaze on the ham. Dad asked if we remembered the year the dog ate the centerpiece, and the cousins did their part by laughing in the right places. But the gravity of the room had shifted by a few degrees, and Ethan felt it in his bones, because he started over-explaining, which is panic in a pressed shirt. He insisted that migrations are messy and that hidden costs would appear like gremlins in the vents. And I, still smiling because I was Tired of clenching my jaw for men who confuse volume with value, said that hidden costs are only hidden to people who do not read their own terms, then traced with my finger across the napkin where the fee table lives in broad daylight. The way a magician reveals there was no trapdoor, just mirrors and practiced misdirection. He came back swinging with a boast about a major announcement he would be part of very soon, a remark so reckless you could smell the non-disclosure burning around the edges, and when he realized too late that he had wandered into a field of rakes, he tried to dress the sentence in hypotheticals, only it was already out there, fluttering above the table like a paper plane with his name on the wing. I did not press, because I did not need to, and besides, there is a particular pleasure in letting a man dig exactly as far as he thinks is safe, while you measure the trench and write down the depth for later. So I went a different way, the way of small, undeniable truths, and I told Grandma that what I am grateful for this year is the chance to make hard things simpler for the people I love. That fixing one invoice might not be a parade, but it keeps a light on in a workshop and pays for a new mower blade, and that I will take the satisfaction of a clean ledger over the shine of a hollow promise any day of the week. Grandma, who has been poor and comfortable and lonely and adored in equal measure over the decades, lifted her glass in a small salute and said that making things truly work is the most grown-up kind of love, which landed with a softness that made my throat tighten even as Ethan's jaw flexed. My revenge for the night, neat and almost polite, was sealed in that handshake with Peter and in the whispered request from Molly for a tutorial later. Because I had taken 2 tiny rivers of attention that had been feeding my brother's little valley and rerouted them through mine without breaking a single rule, and he knew it. Which is why his smile had begun to look like a man holding a door he cannot afford to let swing shut. He inhaled to reset the scene, to reclaim the narrative in the only way he knows, with a joke that bullies the room back into his rhythm. But before the punchline could arrive, Grandma cleared her throat, the table stilled, and the air changed in that precise, pre-storm way that makes even brave people glance at the windows. Grandma did not raise her voice so much as she shifted the floor under our feet, and when she pressed her napkin with 2 deliberate fingers and asked Ethan why he was teasing me about real tech when, as she put it with that tart little smile that never asks permission, he might soon be wearing a badge with my company's logo on it, the room rearranged itself around the sentence like silverware sliding on a tablecloth, because you could see the thought hit him, then hit my parents, then hit the cousins who had been treating the evening like background noise until drama arrived dressed as dessert. He laughed first, of course he did, a short brittle sound that said absolutely nothing was wrong and everything was under control. Then he told Grandma that sometimes the blogs get ahead of themselves and sometimes journalists do not understand how strategic reviews work, and he layered those words with the weary patience of a man teaching a child about traffic lights. Except Grandma has buried 2 husbands, run a shop through 2 recessions, and still reads the business pages with the kind of pencil that draws blood, so she reached into her purse and slid out a printout, an actual printed piece of paper like it was 1998, whose headline mentioned an all-cash acquisition and a timeline, whose body mentioned integration phases and synergy realization, and whose source was not a gossip site, but a trade journal that has embarrassed bigger men than my brother by getting the numbers right when the numbers were still hiding behind sanitized statements. I did not speak, because silence can be a hammer if you let it, and because the final non-disclosure had been signed 2 days earlier after a month of due diligence that left me wired on tea and adrenaline. And because the deal memo sitting in my inbox had my name on the routing sheet under a polite phrase that means my team will be responsible for what happens after the champagne goes flat. I kept my eyes on the gravy boat as if its ridiculous little rooster handle required all my attention. And I let Ethan perform his slow-motion fumble, where he tried to dismiss, then minimize, then reinterpret, then finally suggest that if something like that were to happen it would be a merger of equals, a phrase so soft it could be used as a pillow. And, while he talked, I watched my mother count plates as if the number might save her, and my father adjust the thermostat even though no one was cold, and it occurred to me that they were all doing the only math they knew. Who is the winner now? Who is the disappointment whose version of history survives this meal? Grandma, with the surgical kindness of a woman who knows when mercy is a scalpel and not a blanket, asked me if I could explain, not for the sake of bragging but because, as she said, the family has a habit of celebrating ribbon cuttings and ignoring the people on the bridge, and I took a long breath that tasted like clove and honey and said that the press had some of it right and some of it wrong. That there would not be new badges overnight and that many good people, Ethan included if he chose to be one of them, would have offers to stay and build something sturdier than either company could manage alone, and that integration is not a coronation, but a month-by-month grind where the dullest problems can wreck the fanciest promises. I said all this slowly, with the caution of someone counting live wires, and then added that for now I could not discuss anything that was not already public, which is the kind of sentence that sounds like corporate theater until you watch a cousin who has been living invoice to invoice relax at the thought that the lights will still come on when he flips the switch. Ethan's face did that complicated thing it does when shame and stubbornness collide, and for a moment I saw the kid who used to steal my pencils and blame the dog for his homework, a flash of that clumsy fear hidden behind the showmanship. And it would be a lie to say I did not feel something like pity, because I know what it feels like to have the narrative pulled out of your hands, but pity is not the same as surrender, and this night was not a confessional, it was a ledger finally balanced. So when he tried one more time to cheapen the moment by calling it a nice career move, as if I had changed companies like you change shoes, I let the line pass through me and pivoted, with a smile that barely showed teeth, to my final act of revenge, which was less a strike than a quiet redistribution of gravity. I thanked Peter for trusting me enough to move his invoicing and said I would email him a checklist tonight so he could close the books without another late fee, and then I told Molly that I would share a template and a link for the upload endpoint she needed. And I asked Grandma, because she has always loved a to-do list, if she wanted me to swing by tomorrow to clean up the junkware on her laptop so she could stop fighting the update pop-ups, and as each person answered yes without glancing at Ethan for permission, I felt the table tilt decisively away from his borrowed spotlight toward something plainer and truer, the sound of usefulness taking the microphone from performance without raising its voice. We ate pie, because even revelations need a crust, and conversation restarted in a new key where people talked about errands and deadlines and the price of mulch, while Ethan picked at his plate and my parents alternated between tight smiles and questions they were not ready to ask when I stood to help with coffee. Grandma squeezed my hand and whispered that she had not meant to show off, but she was tired of watching the family applaud the ribbon while ignoring the bolts, and I told her I was not angry, that I had been angry for so many years I could recognize the echo of it in any room, and that tonight felt less like a victory lap and more like a hand on a door I have been pushing forever finally giving way, not slamming open, not closing, just moving enough that I could see a hallway I had not been allowed to walk down. Outside, the evening had that early spring chill that makes the air smell like damp soil and gasoline, and as I carried the coffee tray back and I caught my reflection in the glass of the sliding door, a woman who looked steady and a little tired and not unkind, and I asked myself the question the room was asking in its own skittish way, which is whether this moment fixed anything or merely revealed where the cracks have been hiding, the truth, which I will not say out loud because it does not need an audience, is that acquisitions do not heal childhoods and titles do not repair old loyalties, and yet there was something clean in the way the silence settled when Grandma spoke, a cleanliness that might allow for new sentences later if people choose them carefully. As for Ethan, he avoided me on the way out, then paused at the door long enough to say that we should talk after the dust settles, a phrase that can mean truce or threat depending on the wind. And I told him that if he wanted to build something real he knew where to find me, that the door was not locked, but it was heavy, and he would have to push it himself. He nodded, the kind of nod a man gives when he is not yet ready to be anyone's partner. And he left without looking back, while Grandma tucked her printout into her purse, as if it were a recipe she planned to make again. I drove home under a sky that could not decide between mist and clear, the road flickering with puddles that turned streetlights into ribbons, and I let the quiet fill the car until the nervous energy finally burned itself down to a pilot light. I do not know whether the next holiday will be kinder or whether this night simply marked the moment we all ran out of places to hide, and I do not pretend that my clever little victories are anything but kindling against a bigger cold, though kindling, tended properly, can warm a room. What I do know is that the bridge will hold, because I know the bolts and I know the hands that keep tightening them, and if the toll collector wants to cross he can, but he will walk, not strut. And he will read the posted weight limit like it was written for him.